Thanks for joining us. Welcome to the Eureka Centre. I'm Anthony Cann, the manager here at the Eureka Centre. Tonight we present Beyond Tolerance, Strengthening Social Cohesion in a Multicultural Society, a conversation between journalist Dellaram Vreeland and demographer and sociologist Andrew Markus AO. This is a Eureka Centre event presented for Ballarat Harmony Fest. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we meet tonight on the lands of the Wadawurrung people, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Politicians like to say that Australia is the most successful multicultural country in the world, but what does that mean really? Today is the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, and I think we'd probably all agree racism's going nowhere. It's still around and we're certainly facing many challenges as a community. Divisive voices are increasingly claiming space and even being accommodated in mainstream politics. Exclusive nationalism, populism and xenophobia is on the rise around the world, and social media is providing a platform for hate speech. So how do we find common ground as a society and as a nation in these divisive times? How do we move beyond tolerance to build a genuinely cohesive community that draws on our intergenerational, intercultural and interfaith wisdom? I need to be clear that tonight it's not a debate or a Q&A type event. We are committed to creating a safe space for everybody here, but particularly those that might have experienced racial or religious discrimination. So there won't be any questions after today's session. It's really an opportunity to listen to Dellaram and to Andrew, draw on their professional experience and also their lived experience, and just sit with the conversation as they work through the many issues attached to this sometimes challenging topic. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Dellaram Vreeland is a journalist, an Australian-born Iranian working and living on Wadawurrung country. Raised in Ballarat, she has spent more than 14 years working as a storyteller, promoting rural and regional communities. Dellaram's work has appeared in Guardian Australia across various Nine and Australian community media mastheads, as well as in a variety of lifestyle and travel publications. As a Baha'i with a desire to build community, she has a particular interest in multicultural affairs, arts and culture, social justice and stories that cast a spotlight on all that is good in the world. Andrew Markus AO is Emeritus Professor in Monash University's School of International Historical and Philosophical Studies. Since 2004, he has been a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia. His research specialisation is in the field of racial and ethnic relations, ethnic communities and immigration policy. In 1988, he was commissioned to prepare a report on how Australians see each other for the Fitzgerald Committee, which advised the Hawke government on immigration policy. In 2007, he established the Scanlon Foundation's Mapping Social Cohesion annual reports. He has extensive experience researching Australian public opinion, including a commission report for the Victorian Research Institute on Social Cohesion on protests in Bendigo to the proposed building of a mosque, which was completed in 2018. Now, at this point, I'll hand over to Della, who will lead this conversation with Andrew. So please join me in welcoming Andrew and Della.
Thank you so much, Anthony. I'm so excited to be here tonight. Very honoured to be here to facilitate what I believe is such a vital discussion on how we as a society can contribute to a more vibrant and stronger community in an ever-increasing multicultural world. Before we begin, I too would like to start by taking a moment to thank the traditional custodians of the land, the Wadawurrung people, and to extend that gratitude to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, those who for more than 60,000 years have shown this vast country of ours the respect, love and care that has allowed all of us, including the millions of migrants, such as my own family, to find a new home and live a life that is free, safe, and dignified. I extend that appreciation to all elders, past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge that this land always was and always will be Aboriginal land. My family first moved here as refugees in the early 1980s, having fled Iran only a few years prior. It was the beginning of the Islamic Revolution and the persecution against members of the Baha'i faith, a minority religion whose primary aim is the promotion of prosperous communities, founded on the premise that we are one human family, was only set to intensify. The safest course of action for them was to give up everything that they knew and loved and to leave their homeland. In the early 1980s, Australia's refugee program expanded to an annual intake of up to 22,000, the largest annual intake in 30 years and at a level not ever seen. Australian government statistics show that just over 940,000 refugee and humanitarian entrants have arrived here between 1947 and 2022. Of course, when we look at the canvas that is multiculturalism in this country, refugees only paint part of that picture, but it gives us a glimpse of Australia's cultural fabric. About 10 years after settling in Australia, we moved to Ballarat, where we have lived ever since. And I like to think that being here for over 30 years, I am now local. Some people might beg to differ, but maybe my children and grandchildren stand a chance. In the past 3 decades, I've watched as my city's cultural fabric has evolved significantly. But with that evolution, of course, there's come challenges, and some of those we will touch on tonight. While March 21 is known Australia-wide as Harmony Day, it is also marked as the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Prejudice. So as well as being a day to celebrate diversity and embrace multiculturalism, I do think it is as important to reflect on some of those more divisive issues that perforate our communities, such as populism, exclusive nationalism, and xenophobia. So I welcome Andrew tonight and look forward to delving deeper into this concept of social cohesion, looking at some of the elements that are disrupting our social fabric within our evolving multicultural communities, and also exploring how we can work together to strengthen our communities in very practical terms. To begin, I'd like to dissect this term, social cohesion, itself, because it might be a foreign term to a lot of us. So I will pass it to Andrew.
Okay.
It's quite a contested concept, and there isn't really a blanket definition, but maybe you could provide us, with some of the core dimensions, I guess, that characterise this concept, because it's basically your beat, Andrew.
Yep. Okay, thank you. And hello everybody. I'd like to join Anthony and you also in paying my respects to the Ballarat people, the traditional owners, and their elders past, present and emerging. All right, so what is social cohesion? With a lot of terms, it's easier to say what isn't social cohesion. And I think we probably would find it easier to point to many parts of the world where there is no social cohesion. In the present difficult context, I find myself thinking that I'm lucky that my parents came to this country, which is not to say it's a perfect country because they don't exist, but compared to many other parts of the world. And it's also interesting that you mentioned that your family came as refugees. Yes, my family came as refugees. So that might be a somewhat unusual conjunction that we have two whose parents, families came as refugees to settle in this country. And I guess, certainly in my case, I don't want to speak for you, but the opportunities that were given. And when I look at, so my people came in the 1950s, late 1950s, and the opportunities that cohort of immigrants, refugees, were able to, experience in this country. I think it got harder post 1975. There was that long boom, and the people who came in the long boom, which sort of came to an end in 1972, 73, certainly had amazing opportunities. One of the issues we have today is the housing crisis. When we think back, the first houses our parents purchased, and you're looking at $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 for a very nice place to live. Now, obviously, wages were much lower then, but there was still much more of an opportunity that people had. So, we want to come back to this, but the greatest predictor, we're not quite there in the discussion, but the greatest predictor of social cohesion is the economic fortunes of the population. And where you have people who are struggling, who have found difficult to pay their bills, who've been unemployed for a period, any study that we do, that would be the best predictor of people who don't feel that they belong in this country, that they feel excluded, that they don't have the opportunities. So there's that aspect. But, as for defining what is social cohesion, we can point to various characteristics. And probably you don't want me to sort of go into any sort of long list. But I think also in some of the material that you had prepared, like trust, is a central element. So if we look at that node of economic opportunity, educational opportunity, and then one of the outcomes of that would be people's sense that you can trust people. Now, I can trust you, you can trust me. If afterwards we discuss something, you're not going to punch me in the head. So trust in its various dimensions. And another way I think of approaching social cohesion is in terms of three elements. One is ideational, which means values, shared values or not. So it's about the way people think about each other and the way they think about their society. A second is behavioural, like do you participate in the society? Like do you vote? Are you interested in politics? Are you interested in your local area? Are there problems in your local area? Do you get together with people to try to resolve those sort of issues? Do you have any interest in local government? I think local government is a very important element in cohesion in our societies, the sort of things that local government do. Like, do you have a sense here that in Ballarat, the local government has like a sort of a hands-on relationship with the population and can be seen to be actually, even though they may not have much money, be seen to be doing useful things?
Yeah.
Like even garbage, like recycling.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Like giving small grants to organisations. Yes. A whole range of activities, so that behavioural sense in the local government. And it's also interesting to see the representation in the local government. Like I'm doing a study at the moment of a very diverse part of Melbourne, Springvale. Some of you will know it. So Springvale is part of Greater Dandenong, which is one of the most multicultural areas in Australia. And in Greater Dandenong today, I think like 6 of the 11 councillors are of immigrant background.
Yes.
And in the last 20 years, the majority of the mayors have been from an immigrant background. And also, it's not just men, because the most recent mayor was a lady who managed to get pre-selected for the seat vacated by Premier Andrews and is now a member of the Legislative Council. and her background is of Indian heritage. So there's been this quite interesting element of the way that people can participate, the behavioural element. And the last aspect is distributive. Distributive is about resources, like the economic resources, how well they're shared in a society or net shared. Educational opportunities and cultural opportunities. Now, I could go on, as you have a sense, but I won't. But I'll just make one point, and that's the educational. You know, I think in terms of our cohesive society going forwards, we've got big problems with our education system, the embedded underachievement. And if you get around to looking at sort of the My School website, which I think when Prime Minister Gillard was leading this country, she wanted to have that up front. So it's based on the NAPLAN test. And I looked up one of the schools in Springvale, one of the primary schools, how they're doing, because the schools are ranked relative to other schools in terms of their funding and in terms of their achievement. And, you know, the teachers there are wonderful. Like during the pandemic, you know, they kept the place going. And it wasn't just education. They went around to people's homes. They dropped off food. They found iPads for people. They got dongles so they could get on the internet. You know, and so amazing, amazing commitment by the teachers. And that school is in the bottom quintile in terms of resources and in terms of the children's ability to read, in terms of the children's ability, a whole range of scores. So, okay, so covered quite a lot, but I think that probably the simplest way to think is we certainly know a society which is not cohesive, and we can recognise elements of a society which is.
So it would be right to say that there are these various components, and when they form, or they coalesce, they come together, and then they form the strengthening this, come together to strengthen this entire body or community. You know, that is what is cohesive. That is what. I mean.
And it's not like you either have it or you don't have it, but it's a spectrum.
Right.
And I think we talked about things coming together and then things coming apart.
Yeah.
So once we may be getting like 80 out of 100 when we're doing really well, never going to get 100. And then you've got these tensions and the fracturing and the coming apart. And the challenge is to sort of recognise that process, like it would be manifested in trust. When we have indications that trust is breaking down, when we have indications that shared values are breaking down.
That's right. So then let's look at multiculturalism and where that stands and how that contributes to this cohesion. And, you know, when you look at the Home Affairs website, for example, and I think Anthony touched on this, it says that Australia is the most successful multicultural, one of the most successful multicultural countries in the world. I mean, what does that even mean? And do you think that it's true?
Yeah, I probably think it is true. But it doesn't mean we got 100% on... We might actually have got 45% or 35%, but most societies are struggling to get to the 10% level.
But what does it mean to be a successful multicultural country?
It means that where you have like a very diverse population, as we have in Australia, and the degree of diversity that we have, it was beyond comprehension for, let's say that we're aged 30, for our parents' generation. That level of complexity of that society, because that generation of the parents or the grandparents, they thought that by some sort of natural law, people of different cultures, and they often talked about different races, they can't actually coexist. That what you will get is you will get riots, you will get that sort of level of physical disruption of a society, which we have seen. Like we saw them, not recent times, but in England, for example, there were periods of significant rioting. You know, in the United States, at various times. Most recently, Black Lives Matter, those sort of protests, which did lead to people being shot and etc. So we haven't had that in Australia.
But do you think there's still something that exists? Maybe you can't see it, but there is that, you know, you can say it's successful because there's a rich diversity of cultures, but is there still an intolerance that exists? Does that not contribute to it being, I don't know, unsuccessful or less successful? And do you think that
Yep.
does exist?
Yes and no. Like, so we do, I was involved in the Scanlon Foundation surveys, and one of the things we were looking at was levels of intolerance. And what we find in general terms is a remarkable endorsement of the ideal of multiculturalism, whatever that might mean. And it means different things to different people. But when we first asked that question, and the question in the survey was, do you think multiculturalism has been good for Australia?
Mm-hmm.
And usually if you do surveys, if you get like 53% agreeing, you're doing okay. So we've consistently got levels of agreement in the 80% level and getting towards like 88, 89% of people agreeing with that. And I couldn't believe it. So we actually did a survey in remote parts of Queensland that had actually elected One Nation members of parliament at the state level. And even in these areas, like sort of in the back blocks of Cairns, for example, Atherton, Tableland, even there, 70 to 75% of people agree with the ideal of multiculturalism.
Yeah.
When we ask questions about a non-discriminatory immigration policy on the basis of race or religion, we will get like 70% or more agreeing with that. So I think in our society there has been a very strong endorsement of like an open society and the ideals of a non-discriminatory approach to immigration and embracing people of different cultures. But when we ask about the specific questions about what about Muslims, what do you think about them, or what do you think about this religion, then we get a much higher level of a negative response, not 10 or 20%, but maybe like 30 or 40%.
Yes.
And interestingly, and I don't know where we're going to go with this one, when we asked, do you think that racism is a problem in Australian society? And this was asked like a year ago, it might be actually much worse than that. But a year ago, 62% of people said that racism is a problem in this country.
That's right. Yeah.
So the problem is how do we general endorsement specific problems?
Yeah. And that was going to be my question, because in the report, there was that relatively high negative opinion towards Australians of Asian, African and Middle Eastern background. But then, as you said, those feelings that immigration is positive. So it kind of has you thinking, is there a discrepancy? Where does Australia actually stand here? You know, are we divided more than we are united, or?
You see, with the highest level of negativity was towards Muslim Australians. And for a number of surveys, that was at 40%. So are you negative towards Christians? And it's like 10%, 15%. Are you negative towards Buddhist or Hindu? It's very low. And towards Muslims, it was 41%. But it's been coming down, interestingly, before this year. So the last survey was down to 27%. It's still much higher than for other groups, but it's not 41%, it's come down to 27%.
Yeah.
And these are rigorous probability-based surveys, so that whatever that might mean, I think it's reliable data. It still needs to be interpreted, but these are reliable numbers. So we seem to have been, in that sense, moving in a positive direction. You know, we also discussed like Bendigo and what happened there with the mosque, which I studied for 18 months. And there was really quite marked division in Bendigo, as I think a number of you might know better than me, but there was like members of the council who campaigned on that sort of issue. And they managed to get international support to oppose the mosque. And then look at the situation today. And they started building the mosque. It's a significant structure. and it's hard to find any mention of it at all.
That's right.
So these sort of things would seem to indicate, going back to that question, are we the most successful multicultural society in the world? We seem to have been, and I'm leaving the current year out of this, we seem to have been moving in a positive direction in a very difficult and problematic area. You know, going back to Muslim, you know that there was a Muslim lady who was mayor. Okay? So embracing that diversity.
Yes.
There was a person who came to Australia in 1982 as a refugee from Cambodia. He's been mayor 5 times. That's really, you know, I can't imagine that sort of progression in a relatively short period of time to a period when there was no one of a migrant background to that situation today, and everyone just getting on with it. Like if we talk about fracturing,
Yes.
there was an opportunity for fracturing during the pandemic. And how did we do during the pandemic? I think we actually don't recognise how well this country did during the pandemic. Do you agree with that or not?
Well, after reading your report, it was very insightful. So I do recommend that, people do pick that up and have a read, because and this is what I want to touch on later, is how much of a role the media actually has to play in portraying whether we are doing well or not, and education as well.
Yep.
And I think we might get to that, but right now, if I could just look a bit more at the grim before we get to the positive. So let's touch on this topic of trust again, and how that has to do with fracturing that cohesion or disrupting that cohesion, and how important or how vital it is, because you refer to it in this document about how it's a key indicator of a cohesive society. And I'm just wondering how we move from a place of fear to a place beyond tolerance, where we're celebrating people of all cultures and viewing humanity as one, striving to build that level of trust, when, you know, of course there's that element of unknown, and there's that element of, kind of things being foreign, particularly in regional and rural areas. It can be quite confronting sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's difficult. Like, for example, like if we're talking of difference and confrontation, like how have people who are physically very different because of their skin colour, say refugees from various African countries, who have settled in regional and rural areas, what has been their experience? And the surveying that we did would indicate that it hasn't been very positive at all. Like, you know, like one of the indicators of trust is whether people are actually willing to fill in a survey. And I had great difficulty even in Melbourne, trying to get people of African background to fill in a survey. Yeah. So in the end, the only way that we even made some progress was by recruiting people from those African communities and paying them, and then not having the survey online, because it's generally online, but actually having hard copies and having people go around to their own communities. So you're basically picking back on the trust that they have within those communities, but not trust in the wider society.
That's right.
Because when someone approaches them from the wider society, so, you know, it's not hard to find evidence of problems, but in a relative context, how are we doing? You know, like, for example, do you follow the news in America? Like, it wouldn't be hard for us to come up with 20 problems that the Americans have got. From the working of their democracy, the working of their judiciary, which are pretty fundamental institutions in a society. Yeah? Like, who here can be very confident that, you know, the way that they're going with regard to their judiciary and the election of the president and so on, they're doing okay? So, you know, within that context, we've certainly got much less issues, but we do have issues. It's not as if we've gone into a safe place. I don't think anyone would think that we're now in a safe place in this country. And just even we were driving down today, and like the latest population numbers have come out. Some of you may have heard that. And so, you know, in the last year, Australia's population increased by 2.5%, or 540,000, which was the highest ever. Now, there's actually a simple explanation of why that is. And I think the explanation is that we're playing catch-up. Because there was no immigration for a couple of years, and the way that the Australian economy has a need for labour, et cetera, we're playing catch-up. But what is happening is that issue is being politicised. So in terms of your balance sheet, positive, negative, the way that our political system has functioned, like compared to America, we're in a totally different space. But we have got big problems there. Because I think we also saw it in the voice referendum, didn't we? The difficulty of having sort of calm and reasoned conversations about very significant issues to do with cohesion and race and incorporation, the difficulty of having reasoned and balanced conversations, we certainly aren't in that position where we can do that.
No. So we'll have to get to how we can get there.
Yeah, that's easy.
And try and solve it tonight.
Yeah.
Before we get to that, I also just wanted to bring up this whole concept of symbols and expressions of our national identity and how they can also disrupt or break up the fabric of our society. You know, these symbols that can be adopted by European Australians and tend to become misappropriated. So we're looking at the Eureka flag, for example, sometimes even the Australian flag. How dangerous are these symbols and ideologies to our social fabric, and do you think there is any way they can be rehabilitated to be more inclusive maybe and of these cultural differences and not kind of be only associated with one particular cultural group?
Yeah, like if we just talk about flags.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a huge issue and so central to the place that we're in. Because that was the Eureka flag. In my time when I was at school, it was a symbol of democracy. Yes?
Yes.
And then various extremist groups appropriated that for their own purposes. And tied it into a particular heritage, which was not multicultural, but was monocultural. And they saw that as a value and what we have here behind us.
Yes.
Again, is that a symbol of cohesion, or is it a symbol of division, which characterises the White Australia policy? And, you know, for me, I don't know how you're going to interpret that, but for me, that is a symbol that highlights the complexity of the White Australia policy and the role of the Chinese gold miners in these communities. Because a simplistic notion of White Australia is all about exclusion. That's not necessarily exclusion. That's about foregrounding a proud heritage. Do you agree with that? That's an interpretation of that symbol or not?
Yeah. I do, yeah.
You know, like I studied the White Australia policy and the goldfields very many years ago. And just reading the newspapers, you did get that view of White Australia's exclusion.
That's right.
But then when you look at local communities such as Bendigo, Ballarat and so on, it starts to become a somewhat different picture.
Yeah.
Like, for example, there were Chinese who played football at a very high level and so on. So that there's that richness and then
yes.
you know, when government tried to deport some people in the, say, 1920s, 1910s, the local communities went around, signed petitions and tried to prevent that happening. You know, more recently is at the Balboa, you know, the case in North Queensland where the government tried to deport a family and the locals, I think, eventually prevailed because there was a change of government and they're still here. So there's that complexity of symbols, appropriation, complexity. A very powerful symbol is the Aboriginal flag. But should the Aboriginal flag be a separate symbol? Or should it be actually, I don't know, people have this discussion, be part of the Australian flag? Just as we have the Union Jack in a corner. And imagine if someone suggested probably they have to remove that and how difficult that would be. So it really shows how symbols are not of minor importance but major importance. And the symbol of a separate, like Torres Strait Islander flag, an Indigenous flag, there are issues there that we probably don't think about very much.
So you've just added a whole different dimension to it. And I guess one of the questions, continuing on from this image that we see behind me, is when we do look at the Eureka Stockade, there are so many, or even the gold field, the time during the gold rush, there are so many stories or, you know, history, elements of that history that are skimmed over. So you've got the stories such as the Black American John Joseph, who shaped the stockade legacy. He was the first in the Eureka treason trials because he was black, or the role that the Chinese migrants played and the discrimination that they faced. They all form such a rich part of this, but, you know, how do we ensure that they remain integral, and is it important that they remain integral in order for that cohesion to, you know.
It is, because it's about how we see our past.
Yes.
Now, the people on the extreme right who sought to appropriate the Eureka flag, what they were doing was they wanted to stamp a particular vision of our past. And the historical record shows that that is not an accurate portrayal.
Yes.
And what's happened with our discovery of the richness of our history is that we see inclusion as well as exclusion, even in what we might call the sort of the height of the white Australia policy. One of the things that opened up new vantage points into our history was that historians who were competent in Chinese language, Mandarin, Cantonese and so on, actually looked at some of the surviving records and showed us that the things were much more complex than a simplistic view of exclusion and making this country a white Anglo-Saxon bastion. That struggle for autonomy, for individuals to express themselves within terms of their own culture, is not something that just happened in the 1970s. It was always there. Like the period of assimilation, the assimilationist policy in Australia, where everyone was going to sort of become, you know, part of a unified nation and abandon their cultures, abandon their languages. It just wasn't happening. And when the government found out that that wasn't happening, and they sort of got onto that in like 1966, 67, 68, then they started to move towards multiculturalism because it doesn't work. And there's big costs when things don't work. Like one of the big costs in the 1960s was that the people that they had brought out into Australia, like Italians and Greeks, many of them actually leaving. It wasn't a wonderful place for them. So they saved enough money and they left. It's a great cost in the Australian government and Australian people. So what I'm sort of walking around is your question about symbols, how important they are, how they are contested, and how they are very important to be contested. So that we deal with people in their richness and diversity and their problems rather than stereotypes.
And then where does education come in amongst all of this?
Yeah.
And broadening the story and ensuring that the symbols are, the education, the history and the symbolism and the expressions are all kind of, how important is that, and are we...
Yeah.
During the referendum, I wrote this story about these kitchen table conversations that were taking place. And one of the people that I interviewed was saying, they were having these conversations and people were still unaware that Aboriginal people had been on our country for 60,000 years. It was kind of a new thing for them. It's like this information. How do we make sure that this history is part of our narrative, for goodness sake,
Like we're in a very troubled place there. Because you like to think that we progress like this. We don't. It's like this. Up and down. So a lot of these rich narratives have been documented and they're out there, yeah? But it doesn't seem to have such a big impact on our conversation as a nation, yeah? And The Voice, I think, is really a devastating, for me, evidence that we're going like this. Like, in our surveys, attitudes to Indigenous Australians are really positive, like 90+%, that we should learn about other cultures.
Yeah.
We're getting plus 90% agreement on that. But then where exactly does that go in the contestation, the political contestation? Yeah. And people use the terminology Australia as a mature nation. But we're probably not that mature. But I don't think that there's many countries that are mature. You've got ideas about this country, that country. The Canadians did a really good job. Then the Canadians, not that long ago, discovered that they were putting various Indigenous populations into like bigger homes than they were doing in Australia. But they were doing the same thing. And they were, young kids died. They were buried on the premises, no trace of them. So it's not an easy story, is it? And also, who can be confident that we're sort of doing better?
But there seems to be this growing consensus that it's truth-telling and understanding the many Australian stories. It's essential in order for us to progress. And if we look at full recognition of the foundation that has been laid by the First Nations people, understanding that we all agree. I feel like there's that growing awareness that needs to happen. But then the referendum happens, and then in Ballarat, 60% vote no, and it's kind of takes reconciliation back decades, and you think, how do you move forward?
Yep.
Do you have the answer?
We probably shouldn't presume to talk for Indigenous people, yeah?
Of course, yeah.
Who've got a multiplicity of views, not one views, but multiplicity of views on that issue, as do all people about any sort of issue that is germane to them. I mean, what we can talk about, I think, is the broader process and the way that issues were handled in the political sphere.
Yes.
As for interpreting what that means, I think that's really for Indigenous people to interpret what that means.
Yes.
But for me, and I think for you, it doesn't cause us confidence. And then when we look at the sort of issues that are on our agenda, it's on our horizon, it's not cause for great optimism from where I sit.
Yes. Just getting a muddled heart sitting here tonight. It's good, but it's not, but it is, but it isn't.
Well, certainly compared to other countries, which is one criteria, we are the best multicultural country in the world. Yeah? But, you know, I always say that means we've got 3.5 out of 10. But
right.
It's still better to get 3.5 out of 10 than to get less than 1 out of 10. And we've got sort of amazing achievements. And then we have challenges which are probably more global challenges than they are distinctively Australian challenges.
Right.
You know, like, for example, climate change and the impact that that's going to have, artificial intelligence and the impact that that's going to have on the workforce. These are global issues. And we do have in politics amazing people, really amazing people who got into that arena of contestation because they wanted to make a difference.
Yeah.
Sadly, you know, often we don't hear about them. There were several Victorian Labor parliamentarian women who have recently died. And so that causes reflection on what they were trying to achieve and what they did achieve and so on. It's sad that that recognition wasn't widespread because what happens is they get to the federal parliament and they're one of 150 people and that focus is lost for most people. But there are these amazing people. And I think here you've had some amazing representatives from Ballarat, haven't you? Very powerful voices who really provided leadership.
I think it can even come just from us, which is something that I'd love everybody here to take away tonight.
Yeah.
Is it's great to engage in this dialogue, and I just think it's so important that we have these conversations. But when you step out of this auditorium, are you just going to think, well, that was some nice information? Or are we going to think, okay, well, what practically can we do now in our own communities in order to take the next step to try and contribute towards this social cohesion in our own networks? And it doesn't have to, we don't have to think even the whole of Ballarat, because that can be overwhelming, or the whole the country, you know, but just in our own pockets. So, yeah, I think, you know, closing now, engaging in interfaith dialogue, promoting cross-cultural understanding. I think in this case it might be very much, a case of preaching to the converted, potentially.
Tell me, have there been analyses of that vote in Ballarat? Like, why was it 60%? Has that been analysed?
I'm not, I can't be completely sure, but yeah, most of the polling stations were no votes. I think there was only a couple, if I remember correctly, that voted yes, that were majority yes. So yeah, it was hard. It was a hard time. But I just wonder how, if you have any personal opinions on how we can, you know, recognise this, that we are all inherently interconnected, rise above this notion that we are different, but that we are one human family, and then take those steps to build these vibrant and strong communities that are composed of these elements that you've been talking about tonight. Yeah. What's one step, or, you know, something practical we can even do once we...
You see, I'm not got to the point of being disheartened.
Yeah.
To basically, you know, staying home and
That's right.
watching the football or something.
Because I think a lot of people do, though, Andy. They feel helpless.
Yep.
And they feel the world is crumbling, it's
Yep.
deteriorating, I can't do anything about it.
Yep.
There's so much division in the world. And in Ballarat, over the last few months, there's a lot that's happened in our community. the media doesn't help when it says Ballarat suffering the trauma of Ballarat and the crisis of Ballarat, and you sort of think, well, okay, that's fine. We've had a very tough few months, and we're all very, very connected as a community too. But personally, I think that does make us stronger as well. So, sorry, I interrupted.
No, I mean, just my personal approach is I do what I can.
Yeah.
And I don't try not to worry about things that I can't impact.
That's my approach too. Yeah.
Like just in the last few months, I read the media. Like I'm not on social media. And in the last few months, I'm very selective about what
I did try and tag you, but I couldn't find you. So.
Yep.
That's why.
And I'm very selective in what I read because it can be just too depressing.
Yeah.
Like America, I just read if I want to be amused. You know, what's Donald Trump done today? If I'm feeling down, I just read about what's Donald Trump done today. That always lifts me up. And some things I don't read because it's going to upset me too much. And I just do what I can. Because one of the things that I take from history, and sometimes I forget, is things that you never expected to happen. So I remember having a conversation in the late 1980s with quite a wise person about what was happening in the Soviet Union. And he said, this is actually something quite significant. That Soviet empire is going to crumble. And I said, rubbish, Look, once they're in control, you could talk about Iran in this context, yes?
I mean, I don't know. I've never been there,
Yeah.
but my mum could.
Yes.
I had it.
Yeah. But things that you think it's never going to come right, and lo and behold, they come right. Yeah. Like even we talked about the apology, which was very significant for very many Indigenous people.
Yes.
In the late 1990s, John Howard, in the way that he was sort of dealing with these sort of issues of apology and respect. And then look what happened. So keep at it, do what you can, and try not to get too depressed.
2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of thing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, no step back.
No step back.
Just 2 steps forward.
Yeah.
And as for the step backwards, I'm choosing to ignore that.
Yes.
And to just also be thankful that with all the problems, we are actually living in a very fortunate part of the world.
Yeah, yes. Just my final question is, I'm just, this whole concept of even disunity, it's not something that simply exists between cultures, it's also within cultures.
Yeah.
It's, so do you think if as humanity we were able to forge one inclusive value system that would ensure some kind of national unity, or is there something, or what could that system look like, or, how do we reach out to those that necessarily aren't like-minded? I remember reading something saying, we always talk about working with like-minded people, but maybe we actually need to work with people that are not like-minded to get somewhere in life. But ensuring we're having open-hearted consultation that is loving and tactful and talking about matters that can be quite confronting and raw and not easy, quite uncomfortable. I think I asked you about 3 questions there.
Yeah. For me, humanity is a basket case.
Right.
Yeah. And a simple example is the internet. Yeah? Humanity created the internet, amazing technology. Most of you will have computers in your homes, laptops, which are actually more powerful than, whole rooms and batteries of computers like 50 years ago. And look at what's happened. Television. Yeah? Like, a lot of you would not have experienced this. Like we were lucky to have black and white televisions that were this big, and there were about 3 programs to watch, yeah? And I can remember in the 70s sort of dreaming that one day, we'll have a colour television set and how wonderful that will be. So this amazing technological achievement of humanity, and then just the sheer bastardry. So, the Soviet Union got out of rule by the Communist Party, and look where they are today. They managed to sell off all the, valuable assets of the country to billionaires, terrible corruption, and there's a terrible dictator. Can I say that? I don't know if anyone's going to... So this is really the challenge. And it's not, however, a cause to be depressed. But it's to be fortunate that we live in a good country, that there are opportunities. The opportunities, like I mentioned that we're both refugees, and I became quite senior in my profession. And I remember talking to a colleague in the 1980s and says, in Germany that couldn't have happened. Yeah? That there were these sort of barriers even today. You don't cross the barriers in the first generation.
Well, as a Baha'i, you wouldn't have access to higher education in Iran.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we are fortunate. We do have these wonderful opportunities. And so what can we do? We can do what we can do. Control your space. Don't let these horrible things into your space. If social media is wrecking your life, there's a simple answer. Take these issues, like be as happy as you can be, rejoice in the good things, and try and make what contribution you can. Is that sort of what I'm probably very fortunate to be able to say that, yeah? Because not everyone can actually say that. But I'm fortunate and I'm cashing in on my fortune to keep doing. Which is not to say that I don't recognise that that's not a viable path of many, many people. But probably there's a path for you. And something that you can actually have some control over, hopefully, but not always.
Professor Markus, thank you very much for your time tonight. And I'd like to thank you all for being here tonight on behalf of the Eureka Centre and the Ballarat Heritage Festival as well. Thank you very much, Anthony, for having us. It was a pleasure. Thank you very much.